They mocked her for 2 straight hours, until the sky split open as if it wanted to swallow the entire plane, and just when everyone thought they were about to die, a forgotten name buried deep in U.S. military records suddenly came back to life. Shadowhawk 7. She appeared as quietly as any ordinary passenger. Ava Morgan, 34 years old, sat in seat 14B, wearing a worn-out flannel shirt, a canvas backpack tucked neatly under her feet, and shoes faded by long journeys. If you looked at her for just a moment, you would probably think, a tired woman heading home after a long work trip. No one knew that, at that exact moment, the plane was heading straight into one of the most chaotic weather systems over the Rockies. As the fuselage shook harder with each passing minute, passengers began gripping their armrests, whispering a few prayers. In that tension, tight-as-a-wire atmosphere, Ava tilted her head slightly, glanced down the cabin, and softly asked the flight attendant, "The cabin pressure. It's dropping, isn't it?" A simple question, yet it sparked fear like a match thrown into a barrel of gasoline. The flight attendant forced a reassuring smile, but in her eyes flickered a quick trace of confusion. She hadn't answered yet when a few passengers up front burst into half-laughs, half-scoffs. A young man in a football team jacket turned around, his voice unnecessarily loud. "Come on, lady, this isn't Top Gun!" A middle-aged woman wearing sparkling earrings frowned and shook her head in irritation. "Some people just need a little turbulence to think they're experts." Laughter, snorts, judgmental stares. All of it converged on Ava. But she didn't react, didn't defend herself, didn't explain. Ava simply tightened the straps of her backpack with her calloused hands, her brown eyes calm, as if she knew something no one else could see. If you had been sitting in that cabin at that moment, you might have wondered, a woman who looks so ordinary, why would she dare claim the cabin pressure is dropping? But sometimes, the people who look the most ordinary, these are the ones hiding a past no one could ever imagine. The initial shaking felt like just a few light nudges from the wind, but soon enough the entire aircraft began to sway violently. The pounding noises from outside echoed through the metal fuselage like thousands of fists striking the plane at once. Adults held their breath. Children burst into tears. A few passengers muttered, "What is happening?" The cabin lights flickered in irregular pulses, creating alternating patches of darkness and light that doubled the sense of panic spreading through the cabin. From row 20 downward, several oxygen masks swayed gently, not fully deployed, but enough to make everyone's chest tighten. Amid the chaos, a tall father suddenly jumped to his feet, his face flushed red with tension. He practically snapped at Ava, his voice trembling, whether from anger or fear was unclear. "Stop that right now! You're making everyone more nervous!" His wife tugged at his arm. "Sit down, honey. Everyone's scared." But he yanked his arm away sharply, still glaring at Ava with an accusing look, as if finding someone to blame would somehow ease his own fear. Up front, a businessman in a Ralph Lauren suit also turned around, his expression unbelievably irritated given the circumstances. "I didn't pay for this flight to listen to nonsense from a passenger who knows nothing. Keep quiet." Murmurs of agreement rippled across the rows. "That's right. She's only making things worse. Just worry about your own seat." A woman wearing gemstone jewelry flipped her hair and looked at Ava with a judgmental stare. "What we need right now is calm, not someone pretending to know everything." But through all the accusations, Ava remained seated. No objections, no explanations. She simply gazed out the window, her eyes calm like a still lake, as if she were calculating something no one else on that plane could even imagine. No one knew that her calm was not blind confidence. It was the calm of someone who had lived through moments far more critical than this. Moments where a single mistake could cost an entire squadron their lives. And inside the cabin, Fear had begun to mutate into blind anger, and no one realized the real disaster had only just begun. The shaking, which had seemed to have reached its peak, suddenly intensified, causing the cabin to tilt left and then jerk violently to the right. Passengers gasped, many clinging to their armrests as if holding on to their last thread of life. A loud noise echoed from the aircraft's body, sounding like metal groaning under immense pressure. And then, whoosh! A row of oxygen masks suddenly dropped from the rear cabin ceiling. A little boy burst into terrified screams. Adults could no longer maintain their fake calm. Shouts erupted in chaos. "Oh my God! Are we falling? Hurry! Put the mask on!" The scene looked like an earthquake striking in the middle of the sky. In row 14, a businessman who had kept a cold, confident demeanor until now suddenly jumped up, his face twisted in tension. He pointed directly at Ava as if he had found the culprit to vent all the panic boiling inside him. "Her! Get her out of here! She's making the whole plane lose control!" Several people nodded on instinct, as though attacking a make-believe threat would somehow restore their sense of safety. But strangely, Ava remained seated. She didn't flinch at the yelling. She didn't avoid the dozens of accusing stares. She simply placed her hand over her backpack, her breathing steady to the point of seeming unnatural. A young mother across from her, trembling as she struggled to place the mask on her child, looked at Ava with confusion mixed with fear. "How can you still sit there?" Her voice quivered, not accusatory, but stunned. Ava answered gently, her tone even and composed. "Because panicking won't make the plane more stable." Her words fell into the air thick with fear, making a few passengers blink in bewilderment. But right then, the cabin speakers crackled, a sign that the pilots were truly in trouble. If moments earlier everyone thought this was just severe turbulence, now they began to understand that what was happening was anything but normal. And the most frightening thing of all? None of them could imagine that the ordinary-looking woman in seat 14B was the only person on that plane who knew what was really going on. The cabin speaker suddenly cut out, replaced by a chilling silence. 1 second. 2 seconds. Then the cockpit door burst open so hard it slammed against the wall with a sharp cracking sound. A man in a flight officer's uniform stepped out, First Officer Daniels, his face pale as if starved of oxygen, sweat streaking down his temples despite the freezing cabin. His eyes swept across the cabin, desperate yet decisive. "We need anyone with military navigation experience, right now." That moment froze the entire cabin. The crying, the frantic breathing, the chaotic shouting, all fell silent. People looked at each other, a terrifying truth settling into their minds. The pilots were unable to handle the situation independently. The flight was in far worse trouble than they thought. A man in the front row called out loudly, "What is happening?" Daniels gripped the seat back, trying to keep his voice steady. "The navigation system is giving abnormal readings. We need someone with military training, otherwise—" He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood the part he left unsaid. The cabin held its breath. No hands rose. No one dared to volunteer. And no one could, either. The lead flight attendant, a blonde woman whose hair bun had loosened from fear, glanced toward Ava. Her eyes hesitated, but then, as if recalling something, she gathered her courage and pointed to seat 14B. She mentioned cabin depressurization. Maybe she knows something?" A sharp, mocking laugh erupted from the front. The woman wearing gemstone jewelry, who had been glaring at Ava with contempt since earlier, stood up abruptly. "Her? She doesn't even look like she could afford a full-price economy ticket, let alone have military training." Several passengers nodded instinctively, clinging to any excuse to dismiss the possibility. A guy in a football hoodie snorted. Yes, sir. Let's put Flannel Girl in the cockpit. Great idea. Laughter rippled outward, bitter and heavy. But Ava didn't laugh. She didn't react. She stood, slowly, calmly. Her face held no fear, only a quiet certainty. At that moment, a large man stepped forward to block her path, his voice thick with repressed anger. Who do you think you are? Ava looked straight into his eyes, not aggressive, not challenging, just a simple truth spoken with a voice as steady as still water. You just wasted 2 minutes judging me. And 2 minutes is enough to lose a wing. The words hit the cabin like a falling stone. No more laughter, no rebuttals, no movement. Co-pilot Daniels looked at Ava for a long second, and he saw what everyone else had failed to see. These were not the eyes of someone panicking. They were the eyes of someone who had stood at the edge between life and death, more than once. He simply nodded, a single nod that shifted the fate of the entire flight. Ava stepped forward. Each of her steps seemed to quiet the cabin a little more. Hundreds of eyes followed her, half doubting, half desperate, but all sensing there was something very different about this woman. And none of them knew that the cockpit door was about to reveal a truth the entire United States had once buried deep inside classified files. The cockpit door stood slightly ajar, the dim glow from the control panel casting tense shadows across the faces of the two pilots. The narrow space felt so heavy that even breathing too hard could disturb the chaos simmering beneath the surface. Ava stepped in, light as a silhouette. Yet her presence made Captain Reeves, a man who had logged thousands of hours over American skies, pause for a beat. Co-pilot Daniels quickly shut the door, his voice trembling with both fear and hope. You have training, don't you? Ava did not answer. She walked straight to the control panel, her eyes scanning the dozens of erratic readings, and within seconds she identified the problem that 2 seasoned pilots had spent 10 long minutes failing to solve. Captain Reeves snapped, partly from stress, partly from refusing to accept a passenger touching his controls. Ma'am, step back. This is a restricted area. Passengers are not allowed. Ava spoke softly, but each word dropped into the cockpit like the slice of a cold blade. Shadowhawk 7 requesting co-navigation clearance. In that instant, Captain Reeves froze. The entire cockpit felt as though it had been ripped away from reality. His eyes widened as though a ghost had stepped out of classified U.S. Air Force files. Shadowhawk 7? He repeated, his voice cracking. No. No way. You disappeared. Co-pilot Daniels was stunned as well. Shadowhawk 7? The Utah Canyon team? Ava neither confirmed nor denied. She simply pulled the auxiliary seat toward herself, the movement so practiced it made the entire cockpit tighten with disbelief. There was no trace of panic, no trembling, no hesitation. Ava reached for the control panel, her fingers landing precisely on an old, rarely used switch, one almost no civilian pilots touched anymore, except those from the military. She said, "The pitch system is feeding false data. In reality, we're flying at least 900 feet lower than radar indicates." Captain Reeves gripped the yoke tightly, eyes blown wide. 900? If that's true, then... Ava nodded slightly. We're only minutes away from the mountain ridge. The cockpit felt as if all the air had been sucked out. Daniels clutched the armrest. God. But Ava didn't stop. She activated Echo Terrain, an old military-grade navigation system long removed from commercial aircraft for being obsolete. Captain Reeves stared in disbelief. You know how to operate Echo Wave? None of the newer pilots even, Ava replied softly. Sometimes the old things are the only ones that don't lie. As everything unfolded, the radio crackled with a cold directive from Security Command. No passenger is authorized to touch the system. Remove that individual from the cockpit immediately. This is an order. Captain Reeves reached for the microphone to respond, but Ava turned to look at him, a calm gaze, heavy with meaning. If you follow that order, then you'd better start preparing the recovery teams right now. No one spoke. No one dared. Co-pilot Daniels broke the paralysis first. He placed his hand on the control panel and nodded sharply. I approve. She joins navigation. We have no other choice. Captain Reeves took a slow, deep breath, then reached over and flipped the authorization lock. His voice trembled with both fear and astonishment. It's been a long time since I've seen anyone touch these controls with that kind of certainty. Ava didn't react to the compliment. She was busy, meticulous, precise, moving so fast and so assured that the cockpit suddenly felt infused with something unfamiliar. Hope. In her movements, one thing was unmistakable. These were not the actions of someone who merely understood theory. These were the actions of someone who had flown through the edge of life and death, dozens of times. Outside, lights flickered. Wind howled along the fuselage. The sky darkened as if intent on swallowing Flight 227 whole. Amid all of it, Captain Reeves uttered a breathless realization. She's flying this aircraft like she's in a combat zone. And he was right. Ava had been there many years before, but no one in the cabin knew that her story was far more painful than they could ever imagine. The cockpit door closed behind Ava, shutting out the chaotic screams outside. The cramped space instantly became a battlefield for 3 people, where every breath, every blink carried the survival of nearly 200 passengers. Outside, the blizzard raged like a wild beast. Inside, a silent war began. Ava pulled the auxiliary seat closer to the control panel and tightened her seatbelt. The orange glow from the warning system cast harsh shadows on her face, turning her calm brown eyes into sharp, focused streaks of light, so intense that no one dared interrupt. Pitch offset by 4 degrees. Autopilot is trying to compensate using false data. Ava spoke, her voice steady, fast, and straightforward. Co-pilot Daniels glanced over. You're saying we're lower than what radar shows? Ava didn't look back. Yes, and if we stay on this path, we'll hit the northern ridge in under 3 minutes. Captain Reeves inhaled sharply. That's impossible. We're at 12,400 feet. Ava tapped 2 fingers lightly on the display. A mismatched radar signal flared on the screen. She pointed toward the pitch-black silhouette ahead. That's not a cloud. That's the mountain peak. The truth froze the cockpit for a full second. Daniel's hand trembled. So what do we do? Ava didn't answer immediately. She flipped a series of switches, so quickly that Captain Reeves almost couldn't follow. One of them brought a blacked-out screen back to life, displaying a wave-formed terrain map, the kind modern pilots only read about in training, rarely used in real life. Echo Terrain Navigation System. Old, outdated, brutally honest. Reeves stared at her, astonished. You're trying to manually fly through a storm front? Ava replied, her voice solid as steel. Automation isn't working. We fly this like a combat zone. Then she leaned in and gripped the secondary control column. The warning systems blared non-stop. The plane tilted so hard that Reeves had to cling to the yoke to stay in his seat. Ava commanded firmly. Descend 300 feet, bank left 12 degrees. Follow me. Reeves looked at Ava with a kind of trust he had never given a passenger before. Absolute trust. He mirrored her movements, for the first time in his career, not following procedure, but following the instinct of a woman so unnervingly capable, it frightened him. The aircraft screamed like a wounded beast. Snow consumed the windows, and gusts slammed into the fuselage like artillery fire. In the cabin, passengers were screaming. Some prayed. A child sobbed for his mother. A man clenched the armrests, fighting dizziness as the plane lurched. But inside the cockpit, none of that existed anymore. Only Ava's voice remained, low but clear. Don't be afraid. This plane can take far more than this. Then she pushed the control forward in a short, precise motion that made Reeves gape. That maneuver, it isn't in any civilian manual. Ava replied, I know. One by one, the warning alarms shut off. Beep, beep, click. Then silence. In just 40 seconds, the deadly panic from moments before vanished into a strange stillness, the kind only pilots who've escaped death recognize. Daniels barely managed to breathe out. God, what did you just do? Ava sat upright, eyes locked on the screen, her breathing steady as if she'd completed nothing more than a simple exercise. A narrow slip between two low-pressure pockets. If we were 1 second slower, we would have hit the ridge. Captain Reeves stared at her, not with the eyes of a veteran pilot looking at a curious passenger, but with the eyes of a man who had just witnessed a living legend. You did something only the best combat pilots would dare. Ava simply answered softly, I've had to do it, more than once. Reeves' expression hardened, understanding fully. She wasn't bragging. She wasn't proud. She wasn't seeking credit. It was just the truth, spoken with the eyes of someone who had survived moments no one else could imagine. Outside, the sky began to open a faint sliver of light, just enough to reveal a thin streak of pale blue. Ava murmured, almost to herself, We didn't escape the storm. The storm let go of us. And the aircraft continued gliding forward, no longer a victim of the violent skies, but a steel bird guided through death itself by a nameless hero. Inside the cockpit, the blazing red warnings had just shut off, returning a strange quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists after death has brushed close enough to graze the back of your neck. Ava kept her eyes on the numbers. Captain Reeves kept his eyes on her, as if looking at a story he once believed existed only in classified military reports. Co-pilot Daniels exhaled shakily, words escaping him before he could filter them. She's not a passenger. She's something we haven't had in years. A combat pilot. In the cabin, passengers still didn't know what was happening, but they could feel it. The aircraft was no longer shaking. The wind no longer pounded the fuselage like a hammer on steel. Screams faded into sobs, then into trembling breaths. In row 14, where Ava had once sat, her small backpack still rested on the seat. And then something unexpected happened. An older man with white hair, thin but resilient like an old oak, slowly stood. He walked toward Ava's seat, ignoring several passengers who frowned and warned him not to touch someone else's belongings. The older man muttered, "Let me see who that woman really is." He bent down and carefully opened the worn canvas backpack. Inside there was no makeup, no personal luxury items, no fancy belongings. Only a small notebook, the leather cover fraying at the edges. A metal clasp was slightly rusted. But what made the older man freeze was the faded logo in the corner, the emblem of the United States Air Force. He inhaled deeply, hands trembling as he opened the notebook. The entire cabin turned its attention to him instantly. A woman asked, "What are you doing?" He didn't answer. The first page opened, and the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Inside were not journal entries, not travel notes, but military flight logs, handwritten with chilling precision. Altitudes, pitch angles, wind vectors, internal communication codes, navigation parameters, and tactical marks only military personnel would understand. The older man swallowed hard, his voice small, but echoing like thunder through the silent cabin. This is not a civilian's notebook. This belongs to a combat pilot. A young man who'd been filming mocking videos earlier lowered his phone, his face flushing purple with shame. The woman with gemstone jewelry, the one who had mocked Ava the most, gasped. No way. She didn't look like... The older man turned, stern-eyed. Combat pilots don't need to look like anything. Several passengers lowered their heads. A little girl hugged her teddy bear tightly and whispered, "Mom, is she a real superhero?" The young mother, who had trembled in fear earlier when Ava stayed too calm, now looked toward the cockpit, her eyes brimming. She's not a superhero. She's the one who saved us. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted. From suspicion to shock to slow, profound understanding. As if everyone realized the same truth. Salvation sometimes comes from the one we judge the most. Right then, the cabin speakers crackled on. It wasn't the co-pilot. It wasn't the captain. It was Ava's voice, calm, steady, warm. "This is passenger 14B. We are stabilized. Prepare for a safe descent in 20 minutes. Please fasten your seatbelts. And thank you for staying calm." In the passenger cabin, where moments earlier there had been panic and blame, people froze, then suddenly burst into tears, applause, and embraces. Applause for survival. Applause for the truth revealed. Applause for the woman they had misjudged the moment she boarded. A young man in a hoodie, the loudest to mock Ava, murmured in shame, "I was completely wrong." An older woman at the back sighed, "That's life. The quiet ones are often the ones carrying the whole sky on their shoulders." But they didn't know. Ava remained silent, still working in the cockpit, unaware that through sheer humility, she had just rewritten the definition of judging others for nearly 200 people. In the cockpit, where only the pilot's shaky breaths remained, Captain Reeves bowed his head and whispered, "Miss, you just did what my entire team couldn't." Ava didn't respond. Her eyes stayed fixed on the sky ahead, as if each passing cloud held memories she wished not to revisit. And as the aircraft began its descent, the cabin, once chaotic, was now filled with a strange, overwhelming sense of gratitude that enveloped everyone on board. The plane descended gradually, cutting through the final layer of thick clouds. Dallas appeared below like a sea of light stretching all the way to the horizon. After all the shaking, screaming, fear, and despair, the cabin was now suffocatingly silent. The kind of silence that only exists when people have just stepped back from the edge between life and death. In the cockpit, Captain Reeves leaned heavily against his seat, still not fully steadying his breath. He turned toward Ava, the woman who had just pulled the entire aircraft away from hopelessness. His eyes carried a respect only those who have faced death together could understand. "You brought 189 people home," he said softly, his voice trembling not from fear, but from knowing he had witnessed something extraordinary. Ava gave a smile, so faint that anyone standing a few steps away wouldn't have noticed. She set down the headset, unbuckled her harness, and said calmly, "We all did our part. What matters is that everyone's alive." She stood and stepped out of the cockpit, not waiting for praise, not waiting for applause, not needing anyone to call her a hero. For Ava, the life and death moment had passed, and that was enough. When the aircraft door opened, passengers who had just survived a brutal emotional battle stepped out on trembling legs. Some cried in relief. Some hugged strangers they'd never spoken to before. Parents held their children close, whispering words of gratitude to whatever had protected them. And then they saw Ava coming down the stairs. Slow, calm, quiet. A young college student rushed after her, heart still pounding from the terror she'd survived. "Ma'am, can I have your name? Just your name, so everyone knows who saved us." Ava stopped. The wind swept her brown hair gently to the side. She looked at the girl with eyes so soft and deep that they left the young woman speechless. "A name doesn't keep a plane in the sky," Ava said. "Skill, calm, and sometimes faith. That's what does it. And today, that's enough." She turned away. No more words. She left behind nothing but a strange, quiet presence, the kind carried only by people who have lived through battles the world will never hear about. In Dallas, the story spread like wildfire. Passengers uploaded shaky videos of the moment Ava stepped into the cockpit. News outlets ran the headline everywhere. The New York Times, CNN, and Fox News all referred to it as Miracle Flight 227. They named her Shadowhawk 7, the ghost pilot. But Ava was nowhere near the airport to hear it. That night, as the President of the United States stood at a podium to award a National Civilian Medal, he said, "If you're watching this, Shadowhawk 7, this country still remembers your bravery." The entire hall rose in applause. But Ava never appeared. In a small garage in New Mexico, an old rock song crackled from a dusty radio. Ava crouched beside a rusted pickup truck, her hands covered in grease. When the radio mentioned the mysterious woman who saved Flight 227, the garage owner poked his head in. "Ava, you hear that? They say some mystery female pilot saved an entire plane." Ava smirked. "Sounds like a nice story." And she kept tightening the bolt, as if that mattered more than any spotlight the world tried to place on her. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching briefly on her wrist, where the faded mark NV7 glimmered for a moment before disappearing under her sleeve. A hero who didn't need praise. A warrior who didn't need her name remembered. A spirit who appeared only when the sky needed someone to stand firm. We never truly know who's sitting beside us. Some carry fear, some carry their past, and sometimes someone carries the entire sky. Don't judge people by what they appear to be, because some will quietly save your whole world when you think you have no hope left. If today's story made you pause for a moment or look at the world with a bit more softness, leave us a small sign, a like, a comment, or share it with someone you care about. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey. This is Deep Life Tales. See you in the following story.